Ron Howard was born Ronald William Howard on March 1st, 1954, in Duncan, Oklahoma, into a family already deeply rooted in entertainment. His parents, Rance Howard and Jean Spiegel Howard, were working actors who raised Ron and his brother Clint on film sets rather than playgrounds. From an early age, Ron absorbed the rhythms of professional storytelling, learning discipline, patience, and emotional awareness long before most children understood responsibility. Acting was never forced on him, but it surrounded him so completely that it felt inevitable. When he was cast as Opie Taylor on The Andy Griffith Show at just 6 years old, Ron didn't simply play a role. He grew up in front of America. The show offered him stability, mentorship, and structure, especially through Andy Griffith, who became a guiding presence both on and off camera. Those early years shaped Ron's calm demeanor and thoughtful approach to life and work. Growing up in Mayberry, playing Opie Taylor placed Ron Howard at the heart of one of television's most beloved series. The Andy Griffith Show wasn't just entertainment, it was a cultural touchstone built on warmth, moral clarity, and gentle humor. For Ron, the set felt safe and predictable, a place where adults treated him with respect and patience. Andy Griffith took his role as mentor seriously, teaching Ron professionalism without ever robbing him of childhood. Yet, behind the comforting image of Mayberry, Ron was still navigating a workplace filled with adults, egos, schedules, and pressures he barely understood at the time. He learned early how to observe people carefully, how tone and behavior shifted when cameras stopped rolling. These observations didn't harden him, but they made him perceptive. Even as a child, Ron sensed that television friendliness didn't always reflect personal closeness, a lesson that would quietly shape how he viewed relationships within the industry. Life after Opie and finding his own voice. After the Andy Griffith Show ended, Ron Howard faced a challenge that defeated many former child stars: how to grow without being trapped by nostalgia. He transitioned smoothly into adolescence with his role as Richie Cunningham on Happy Days, another defining chapter in American television. As Richie, Ron became the emotional anchor of a wildly popular show, balancing exaggerated characters with sincerity and relatability. Despite massive fame, Ron remained grounded, thanks largely to his family's insistence on education, humility, and personal accountability. Yet even during these successful years, Ron knew acting wasn't his final destination. He watched directors closely, fascinated by how stories were constructed. While others chased attention, Ron quietly prepared for reinvention. That internal shift, away from being seen and toward seeing clearly, would later define his legacy far more than his time in front of the camera ever could. Reinvention behind the camera. Ron Howard's transition from actor to director remains one of the most successful reinventions in Hollywood history. His directorial debut, Grand Theft Auto in 1977, was modest, but it revealed a natural storyteller with strong instincts and emotional clarity. Over the following decades, Howard demonstrated rare versatility, moving effortlessly between genres. Films like Splash, Cocoon, Parenthood, Apollo 13, and A Beautiful Mind showed his ability to balance spectacle with intimacy. His work was never about ego, it was about connection. Audiences trusted Ron Howard because his films respected their intelligence and emotions. Winning the Academy Award for A Beautiful Mind cemented his status, but he never became detached from his roots. He remained reflective, collaborative, and deeply aware of how formative his early television years had been, especially the lessons learned about people, power, and perception. Imagine Entertainment and Creative Leadership. Together with producer Brian Grazer, Ron Howard co-founded Imagine Entertainment, a company that would profoundly influence modern film and television. Imagine wasn't built on spectacle alone, but on character-driven storytelling. Under Howard's leadership, the company produced projects that ranged from bold comedies like Arrested Development to prestige dramas and biopics. This role as producer allowed Howard to mentor emerging voices and shape narratives without being the center of attention. His leadership style mirrored his personality, calm, attentive, and inclusive. Rather than dominating creative spaces, Howard encouraged collaboration and long-term thinking. He understood how fragile creative environments could be, especially when personalities clashed or communication broke down. Those insights were rooted not just in adulthood, but in memories from childhood sets where harmony existed on screen while complexity quietly lived just beneath the surface. Family, stability, and perspective. Unlike many Hollywood figures, Ron Howard built a remarkably stable personal life. He married Cheryl Alley in 1975, and their relationship has endured for decades, a rarity in the industry. Together they raised 4 children, including Bryce Dallas Howard, who would go on to build her own respected career as an actress and director. Family became Ron's grounding force, offering balance against the volatility of fame. This stability gave him perspective when reflecting on his past. As time passed, Ron became more open about how early experiences shaped him, not with bitterness but with clarity. He recognized that childhood work environments, no matter how well-intentioned, carried emotional complexities. These reflections laid the foundation for his eventual comments about fellow Andy Griffith Show cast member Jim Nabors, a subject he had approached carefully and thoughtfully for decades. Ron Howard on Jim Nabors. For many years, Ron Howard avoided discussing his personal dynamic with Jim Nabors, who played Gomer Pyle, preferring to honor the show's legacy rather than complicate it. When he eventually addressed the subject, his words were measured and reflective, not accusatory. Howard acknowledged Nabors' immense talent, professionalism, and the joy his character brought to millions. At the same time, Ron gently noted that they were very different people, operating at different emotional frequencies. Nabors was older, private, and carried his own internal pressures, while Ron was a child navigating adulthood's complexities. Howard explained that distance sometimes existed, not out of malice, but misalignment. What audiences perceived as universal closeness wasn't always realistic behind the scenes. His comments weren't about exposing flaws, but about acknowledging that working relationships don't always translate into personal bonds, even on beloved shows. The weight of silence and why it ended. Ron Howard's long silence regarding Jim Nabors wasn't rooted in fear or resentment, but in respect for the show, for the audience, and for Nabors himself. He understood how deeply fans cherished the Andy Griffith Show and didn't want to disrupt that affection with unnecessary speculation. Over time, however, Howard recognized the value of honesty, especially when framed with empathy. Speaking decades later allowed him to share perspective without judgment. He emphasized that Nabors was navigating his own challenges in a very different era, one where personal identity and privacy carried heavy burdens. Howard's reflections weren't revelations meant to shock, but clarifications meant to humanize. He reminded audiences that actors, even those who bring comfort and laughter, are still individuals shaped by circumstance, limitation, and the expectations placed upon them by fame. Understanding Jim Nabors as a human being. In reflecting on Jim Nabors, Ron Howard made clear that admiration and complexity can coexist. Nabors was a gifted performer whose voice, timing, and warmth left a permanent mark on television history. At the same time, Howard acknowledged that no one should be reduced to a single public image. Nabors lived much of his life privately, protecting parts of himself the world wasn't ready to accept at the time. Howard expressed compassion for that reality, noting how isolating fame could be when authenticity felt risky. Rather than condemning or idealizing Nabors, Howard framed him as a man shaped by his era, talented, reserved, and navigating pressures quietly. This balanced perspective reframed old assumptions, replacing myth with maturity. It allowed fans to appreciate Nabors' contributions, while understanding that behind every iconic character stands a real, complicated person. What Ron Howard's honesty ultimately reveals. Ron Howard's decision to speak thoughtfully about Jim Nabors reveals more about Howard than anyone else. It shows a man committed to truth without cruelty, memory without distortion, and honesty without spectacle. His reflections don't diminish the Andy Griffith Show, they deepen it. By acknowledging that warmth on screen doesn't always mirror personal intimacy, Howard invites audiences to appreciate the work without demanding perfection from the people behind it. His words remind us that legacy is strongest when it allows room for humanity. In the end, Ron Howard didn't break silence to expose anyone. He spoke to complete the picture. And in doing so, he offered a rare gift: the chance to remember beloved figures, not as flawless icons, but as real individuals who gave what they could, when they could, in a world far more complicated than it ever appeared on television.